All right, time now to talk a little college basketball. And for that, I'm joined by Adam Zagoria, who covers both the NBA and the college level. Adam, thanks for spending a couple minutes with me.
Sure, anytime. Thanks for having me.
Of course. So let's kind of jump in here and let's start with some of the big coaching changes that we're going to see. None bigger than head coach Mike Krzyzewski at Duke finally stepping away. And you have Jon Scheyer, who is really familiar with the program, now officially stepping into the head coaching role. Really emotional, I think, at the introductory press conference, which is nice to see. This organization clearly means a lot to him. How ready is he to step into those shoes?
Yeah, I mean, these are two guys stepping in for legends of the game, right? I mean, between them, Coach K and Jay Wright won 7 national championships. Sheyer's only 35, Kyle Neptune's only 37. And there are big expectations at both programs. Duke is preseason number 7, I think, and Villanova, I think, is like 16. So there's a lot of expectations. We're going to find out if these guys can coach. There's an old expression, it's not about the X's and the O's, it's about the Jimmies and the Joes. And Duke has the number 1 recruiting class for this year and some returning players, including Jeremy Roach, the guard, and Villanova has a bunch of their key guys back and also a great freshman class. So both coaches have excellent rosters.
I do want to touch on each of them individually. And if you've ever been around Mike Krzyzewski or had an opportunity to listen to him speak, I mean, you mentioned the X's and O's versus the Jimmy and the Joes. He had such a way of communicating with kids. And there's such a difference between the NBA and the NCAA, as you know, in terms of being able to understand how to coach a young player. And so, having Jon Scheyer spend some time around him, how much of that do you think can be learned and brought over, and how much of that is intrinsic, so to speak, that Krzyzewski might have just had a way that would be incredibly difficult to follow?
Yeah, I mean, I've talked to both these guys, Jon Scheyer and Kyle Neptune, recently and in recent months. And look, they have to be their own men. I mean, they know they're succeeding legends, but they're not Coach K and they're not Jay Wright. They have to walk in their own shoes. I did talk to some recruits who say, including some of the guys who just committed, that they like Jon Scheyer because he's closer to their age. Their parents like him because they're closer to their age and a little easier to relate to maybe than Coach K, who's 75. The flip side to that, one coach told me is, it might be a little harder for, Jon Scheyer's closer in age to a transfer who maybe is 21, 22 years old. Is he going to command the same respect as Coach K? So those are questions we're going to find out. But I think both guys can look to somebody like Hubert Davis, right, who took over. He's a little older, Hubert, but he took over for a legend in Roy Williams and led Carolina to the championship game last year. He was the first coach ever in his first full season as head coach to lead a team to a championship game. So if I'm Jon Scheyer or Kyle Neptune, I'm looking at Hubert and say, hey, maybe I can do that.
I know Kyle Neptune spent some time underneath Jay Wright, but then also went to Fordham, which is an incredibly difficult place to coach. I mean, the expectations are really high there. How do you think that prepared him for what he's stepping into at Villanova?
Yeah, it's interesting. I talked to John Giannini. He was the former LaSalle coach. He does some analysis now for the Atlantic 10. And he was saying he was impressed that in his year at Fordham, Kyle did not try to just replicate everything Jay Wright and everything Villanova did. He brought in some different defenses and different playing styles and did things on his own. And Jay Wright told him directly, hey, don't try to replicate everything we do. You won't be able to do it right away. So I think that's some good advice for Kyle. And, again, these guys, all eyes are going to be on these two coaches because everybody wants to see how their teams do and how they coach.
I imagine that'll serve him well. And, you mentioned the focus being on these two because of who they're replacing. But when you look around the college basketball landscape, there have been some other significant coaching changes as well. Who else stands out to you that you'll be watching to see how they fare?
Yeah, well, obviously, Shaheen Holloway, right, is a huge story. He led St. Peter's to the Elite Eight last year. Everybody watched the run, a Cinderella run. They beat Kentucky, Murray State, Purdue. And then it was sort of, the biggest, worst kept secret in college basketball that he was going to go to Seton Hall, coach at his alma mater and leave St. Peter's. I actually covered Seton Hall for the Star Ledger and NJ.com. And, he's brought in a few transfers there. He's going to play his same attacking defense style. He wants to play 10 or 11 guys. and he said his goal is to get Seton Hall to the Final Four. Now, I don't know if that's going to happen this year, but there's obviously going to be a lot of eyes and expectations on Seton Hall. Then you have obviously guys like Sean Miller and Archie Miller, both brothers coming back to coach after taking time off. Sean Miller's at Xavier after, let's face it, it was a controversial tenure at Arizona. The NCAA investigated. He still could face, penalties down the road, but Xavier hired him. There's no question he's a great coach. And then Archie Miller, his brother, goes from Indiana to Rhode Island. He's another terrific coach, and there'll be a lot of eyes on them.
For Holloway, it's easier to take a team in some respects like St. Peter's and make a really deep playoff run when you're a Cinderella and nobody expects it. When you've been given all that attention and people are really kind of touting you highly, and then you go to Seton Hall, I imagine that there is an exponential amount of pressure that comes with that. But he seems to have demonstrated that he's up for the task. I love the swagger that St. Peter's had. I mean, that was such a fun storyline to follow, and even to get a chance, because I'm local as well in New York, to get over to New Jersey and be at some of those watch parties when they were making their deep run. I mean, it really felt like what college basketball when it's at its most beautiful. And I wonder, are there Cinderellas? Are there mid-majors that you see already that are going to be able to make deep runs? Is there anybody that you have your eye on?
Yeah, definitely a couple schools. I mean, you always have to mention Iona, I think, right, just because I'm here in New York, but, they're coached by Rick Pitino, who, if he's not the best coach in college basketball, he's on the short list. The guy's only been in the league 2 years. He won the MAC the first year, went to the NCAA tournament. Last year they were upset in their conference tournament, but he's got some good players back at Iona in Nelly Jr., Joseph, a big guy, and Walter Clayton Jr. I like Towson with my guy Pat Skerry there in the CAA. They return their top 4 scorers from a team that I think they won 25 games last year, and to the postseason. NT Bryant, it's another guy we all know in the coaching world, and Jared Grasso. They moved from the Northeast Conference to the America East, so it'll be interesting how he translates. He's got some really some guards he really likes. Earl Timberlake, who was at Memphis and Miami, and Sharif Kenny. He told me they're both big physical 6'5" guards, and Timberlake's a potential NBA prospect. And then Western Kentucky, Rick Stansbury, he's got some interesting players there. Davion McKnight, Boise State transfer Emmanuel Acott, and then Jamarian Sharp, who's a 7'4" guy who was looking at transferring but stayed there.
And then you've got those schools juxtaposed by the schools that we always expect to be there, right? The Kansas, the Kentuckys, the Dukes of the world. Kansas, I believe, is ranked number 7 in the preseason AP poll, but they have undergone a pretty big transition in terms of players that they no longer have. When you look at their roster, do you think that they have enough to be competitive this season?
Yeah, I think first of all, we should just point out that the Big 12 here has won the last 2 national championships, right, with Kansas and Baylor. The Big Ten, for all the talk about how great the Big Ten is, they haven't won a championship since 2000 with Michigan State. And so the Big 12 really deserves credit. There's a lot of great coaches in that league. Baylor is going to be – I know you asked about Kansas, but I think Baylor is going to be really good. The NCAA tournament's all about guards, and Scott Drew's got Keontae George, a freshman, along with Adam Flagler and LJ Cryer. And then Kansas, to your question – yeah, they obviously did lose a couple NBA guys in Ochai Agbaji and Christian Braun, and also the big guy David McCormick. But I think Jalen Wilson can step up and be a star. They have a great freshman in Grady Dick, who's a tremendous shooter. And then they get Kevin McCullough, the transfer from Texas Tech. So he stays within the Big 12, and he's kind of a proven Big 12 commodity.
Has the NCAA tournament always been so guard-centric? I mean, I know it does come down to specific team matchups at that point in the year, but we're starting to see that translate a little bit to the NBA as well. I mean, there's a real premium placed on guard play. Has it always been that way? Is this something that we've seen over the last couple of years that's been a little bit different, or has at least picked up in intensity?
I think guard play is always important in any level of basketball. I mean, if you have, especially in college basketball now where there's been a move The transfer portal is so important. If you can have, 20, 21, 22-year-old guards with a few years of experience, that's really going to make a difference. I think you look at the teams that have won the national championship in recent years, the Villanova teams, Kansas, they've all had veteran guards.
I love that you bring up the transfer portal because that has become such an important recruiting tool in the NCAA. And as you kind of assess what we've seen, who are some of the players that you think could potentially have the biggest impact this season?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I will say there's a couple things happening right now that are really interesting. Manhattan fired their coach, Steve Masiello, last week. I actually broke that story. And their preseason player of the year, Jose Perez, who's a 6'5", guard from the Bronx, transferred yesterday to West Virginia. I don't think it's exactly clear when he's going to be eligible. I don't know if he can start playing right away or maybe has to wait till January, whatever. He averaged 19 points and 4.5 assists last year. So that's kind of a almost unprecedented situation where the coach gets fired in October and the kid might suit up for another school in November. So he's excited about going to West Virginia. That's going to be interesting. The Imani Bates deal, right? People may not have kind of forgotten about Imani, but he transferred from Memphis where he was playing for Penny, had kind of a disappointing year. Now he goes home to Eastern Michigan. He had a little trouble recently. He was pulled over by the police in a car with a gun in it. His attorney was able to get him off. But, that's going to be a big story, just how good is Imani Bates? NBA scouts are going to want to go watch him. Does he live up to the hype? I mean, this is a guy who was compared to Kevin Durant. And then just, all your sort of normal transfers. Tennessee has a kid, Tyreek Key from Indiana State, who sat out last year with a shoulder injury, I believe. And the other day just went for 26 against Gonzaga in an exhibition. So that's a name I don't think a lot of people were really focusing on too much, but guy drops 26 points on Gonzaga. You got to pay attention to him. Kendrick Davis at SMU, went from SMU to Memphis. He's probably everybody's top transfer in the offseason. He averaged, I think, 19 points plus in the last 2 seasons. Now he goes to the big spotlight playing for Penny in Memphis. Kevin McCullough, we mentioned at Kansas. Nigel Pack goes from Kansas State to Miami. He was an all Big 12 player last year. So, I think the coaches use the portal to almost like free agency to add veteran guys and plug in at spots that they need.
Yeah, it's an interesting development that we've seen, how teams have become reliant on using this transfer portal to fill in the gaps as they go. And then you've, of course, got the one-and-done guys, these incoming freshmen who everybody has their eyes on, who might not stick around. Who are some of the top freshmen that we should be paying attention to heading into the season?
Sure. Well, we mentioned a couple of them already. Baylor, Keontae George, a really highly touted guard going to play for Scott Drew, who's going to blend in with 2 veteran guards there. Duke, as I said, has the #1 recruiting class in the country. I mean, what was interesting about that was John Shire was out recruiting last summer, in the summer of 2021, even though Coach K was technically still the head coach for last season. Shire headed up all the recruiting in the summer of 21, and he gets this class with Derek Lively, who's a 6'10" forward, Kyle Filipowski, another 6'11" big guy, Dariq Whitehead, a 6'5" wing. So he's got a stud class there coming in. All those guys are projected lottery picks. There'll be a lot of NBA scouts at the Duke games. Villanova has never had a one-and-done in the one-and-done era, never had one under Jay Wright. They bring in Cam Whitmore, a 6'6" wing who's sidelined now, I guess, with a finger injury, but he's expected to come back, and there'll be a lot of eyes on him. So those are some of the freshmen.
Such a savvy move on Duke's part to lay out a path for what will ultimately be a passing of the torch. To have your head coach be recruiting a year early is advantageous and kind of mind-blowing when you think about just how smoothly they seem to run. We'll see what happens with Shire at the helm, but an interesting choice there. And then, from a macro view, Adam, you had John Rothstein break the news the other day that the NCAA is in talks to potentially expand NCAA, teams by 25%, which would include moving March Madness from 68 teams to potentially 88 teams. I mean, what's your thought on that potential expansion?
I mean, I think my basic instinct is the NCAA tournament is not broken, so don't fix it. I mean, I think it's kind of perfect the way it is. The one thing you don't want to do, which I think everyone agrees, is somehow cut out the mid-majors and take steps where you're just loading up on Power 5 and Power 6 schools, taking 8 or 10 teams from every major league and not letting the St. Peters of the world and the UMBCs of the world, have a chance. That's what's so great about the NCAA tournament, and what we saw with St. Peters last year. Some of those games got some of the biggest ratings of the whole tournament and bigger than NBA games. So even if they expand it, I hope we're not cutting out the mid-majors.
Yeah, I'm not sure it's really analogous, but I think about greed. I mean, for lack of a better word, I think about the NFL shortening up the preseason, and then as a result, you get a ton of injuries early, some really bad football through the first 3 weeks of the season. There's only so much you can do. There's only so many ways you can improve something or make it better. And the NCAA tournament is so good as it is right now. I mean, is it about inclusion? Is it about money? Why would they make the decision, as you say, to fix something that's really not broken?
Yeah, I mean, look, money drives, sports, college sports and all the sports, as we know. I mean, 88, it's, then you're adding a couple more rounds. It makes the tournament longer. I'm not sure I love that idea. I think the way it is right now, 3 weeks, it's arguably the greatest sporting event of the year. That first weekend with the first couple rounds of games, everybody's watching it in bars and around the country. And we've had some great storylines, as we've said, between UMBC being the first 16 to beat Virginia a couple years ago, and then the St. Peters run. So, if they do expand it again, I just hope they don't eliminate smaller schools.
And I imagine, Adam, I mean, there's no putting the genie back in the bottle, right? You make a decision to try that. You can't undo what you've done.
Yeah, I mean, they've been expanding the tournament over the years. When UCLA won all those titles under John Wooden, it was a smaller tournament, then it got to 64, now 68. So I'm sure if they carefully think about it and figure out a way to expand it, in the right way, it could be good. But it's kind of hard to imagine. It's sort of exclusive the way it is now. There's always a conversation about, these 3 or 4 bubble teams didn't make it and who got left out. And once you expand it, that big, then it's almost like everybody gets it.
Yeah, everybody gets a trophy, right? I want to ask you about a couple more teams. How about Gonzaga? A national championship has eluded them, but they've had such talented squads over the last couple of years. Do you think that they could potentially break through this year and win it all?
Can they? Sure. I mean, they're the preseason number 2 in the team in the country. Mark Few is a tremendous coach. I mean, he's won 30-plus games. I don't know how many years in a row. They're kind of getting to be like the Buffalo Bills of college basketball, right? They lost the 2 championship games, one to Carolina, one to Baylor when they were undefeated. It's interesting how he's built that program. He's brought in some one-and-dones now, right? Like Chet Holmgren, who's injured this year, was a top 2 pick in the draft, but he's also had guys like Drew Timme. Seems like he's been there forever now. So he's blended some elite freshmen with some upperclassmen. He lost Holmgren and Andrew Nembhard to the NBA, brings back Drew Timme. They've got some other really good pieces on the roster, Julian Strother and other players. I'm sure it's concerning that they just, they got beat by Tennessee the other day in an exhibition game. But Gonzaga is always going to be a team to watch. Some people think they kind of load up in their league and just dominate their league, and that doesn't prepare them for the tournament. So, it's kind of like unless they win a championship, they've come up short.
Let's end with the number 1 team in the preseason polls, North Carolina, who have now solidified their long-term coaching plan. It seems like they are in position to do something really special, but there's a target on their backs and a ton of pressure. I mean, are they as advertised, and do you expect them to be there at the end as well?
Yeah, I'll say here, I think NIL, we haven't discussed NIL at all, but that played a big factor. I wrote a story on Forbes about that. They bring back Armando Bacot, who's, I think, making high six figures in NIL money. And he said that was a factor in why he could have gone to the NBA. He was a peripheral draft pick. Maybe he ends up in the G League. He's making more money at North Carolina as a college student than he would have in the G League or as a fringe NBA player. And then they bring back Caleb Love and RJ Davis and Leaky Black. So NIL definitely helped schools like North Carolina solidify their guys. And I think that's good for college basketball because it keeps these sort of peripheral, second round guys in college for longer. And also there's a lot of big men who will have an impact in college basketball this year. Armando Bacot, Oscar Tshiebwe at Kentucky, Drew Timme at Gonzaga, Hunter Dickinson at Michigan, Trace Jackson Davis at Indiana. And these are all guys who, because the NBA doesn't really value the traditional low post big man anymore, these guys stay in college more, and that's good for college basketball.
We've seen name, image, and likeness have an impact on some of the more periphery sort of levels with certain players. I remember the guard from St. Peter's last year, his name's escaping me right now, signing like a Buffalo Wild Wings deal. And that was really fun, and everybody loved that. And then there's some other players too across the entire sports landscape where you're like, oh wow, good for them. But when you look at NIL and the potential impact that it is inevitably going to have in college sports, is college basketball the place where you really feel like it could come into play the most?
Yeah, and I know we haven't really discussed women's college basketball here, but I've written a few stories on Paige Beckers and on that, and it's really an impact in women's college basketball. Somebody like Paige Beckers, who's the UConn star who's injured this year, the women can make more money in NIL than they do in the WNBA. Mm-hmm. Now, the women aren't allowed to go really to the NBA until after their senior year, whereas the men can go after one. But, it's great for players like Paige Beckers and Caitlin Clark, the Iowa star, and Aaliyah Boston at South Carolina. Because, again, WNBA salaries are really only like in the five figures, and they can make six figures from NIL money while they're in college. So that's good for women's college basketball.
That's actually a phenomenal story. I'm going to check that out. I think you bring up a really interesting point there that I didn't think about. And now unfortunately, I think some of the ripple effects of what we've seen with Brittany Griner playing overseas, I don't know if that will fundamentally change what women decide to do and how they operate internationally. But it's been so long-standing that if you want to make money, you have to go play, overseas. That to me is fascinating, that a young woman could maybe target a really lucrative college career and then figure out what's kind of beyond that for them. I imagine that will have a pretty significant impact maybe moving forward on what we see in the women's game.
Yeah, I mean, again, you look at these few big stars like Caitlin Clark and Paige Beckers. That's good for college sports and women's college basketball, that they're able to stay on campus for 3-4 years and help their university, but also get some money for themselves. I mean, let's face it, these athletes have for years helped the universities make a lot of money, from their TV deals and everything, and the athletes never got paid. And now it really is a free market where you can earn some money. Now, I had a funny line from Bob Huggins, a West Virginia coach, who said what he liked about NIL was, for years, kids asked him to borrow his car. And now he doesn't have to lend it to them because they all have their own cars. And I think there's definitely some question about, is it pay for play? And are certain schools, it's kind of the Wild West. There's no real regulation. Certain schools are probably doing some shady stuff. But it definitely helps, a team like a North Carolina keep their core together and come back to try to get the title, and it helps the women's stars earn more money than they would in the pros.
Fascinating stuff. Adam, thanks so much for spending the time with me. Just remind everybody one more time where they can find your stuff.
Yeah, I'm in the New York Times, NJ.com, and Forbes, and you can just find me on Twitter at Adam Zagoria.
Adam, real pleasure. Thanks very much for your insight.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Thanks.